Hello, and welcome back to the Buddhist Studies podcast. My name is Kate Hartman. I'm an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Wyoming and host the Buddhist Studies podcast for yogic studies. And I'm here today with Pierre Salguero, who is professor of Asian history and religious studies at Penn State University's Abington College. He is also the instructor of our upcoming BS 111, Buddhism and Medicine. So thank you so much, Dr. Pierre Salguero, for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, we always, appreciate this opportunity to talk with instructors and learn a bit more about the course and what went into creating it and what is motivating you about exploring these interests. But maybe we can start a little bit further back. What motivated you to study these things? How did you get into the field of studying medicine and Buddhism?
Yeah. So I guess I should start by saying I was always interested in religions, and I have been since I was a kid. I was involved in all kinds of different kinds of spiritual practices and martial arts and other kinds of things in high school. And in college, I combined those interests together in a double major in cognitive science and anthropology. So I was really interested in sort of big questions about the mind and consciousness and how all of that works, and then also in sort of like the lived religion and practice, the lived experience and practices of religions around the world. I had a lot of interest in Latin America, which is where my family is from and where I had my early childhood. But eventually it was the Asian traditions that drew me in the most. And so when I graduated from college in 1996 from the University of Virginia, I traveled to Southeast Asia. I spent, it was supposed to be a 6-month trip with a friend of mine, sort of backpacking around and celebrating our graduation and kind of like exploring, the world together. But for me, it turned into a 4-year stay because of what I discovered when my friend and I arrived in Thailand, which was the last destination that he and I traveled to. But for me, it became the beginning of the next chapter of my life. So I didn't go back to the States as planned. I wound up staying sort of home-based in Chiang Mai and making a lot of side trips to other parts of Thailand and also eventually to India as well. But what drew me there, really the sort of main focus of the next 4 years was a combination of two things that I learned simultaneously, or immediately one right after the other, which was I've discovered a 10-day Vipassana silent meditation retreat, and I discovered a 10-day traditional Thai medicine training program. And so I did one and then the other and was just absolutely in love with both of them. And continued for the next, over the coming years to go back and forth between Buddhist centers, meditation and meditation centers and monastic centers on the one hand, and then various types of trainings at traditional medicine hospital and clinics and with apprenticeships with individual healers to learn Thai medicine. And I always say that the thing, this kind of combination of Buddhism and medicine for me was it came right from the beginning, because when I was at the meditation centers and the monasteries, I saw the practice of healing by monks and by people involved in meditation training on the one hand. And then when I was in the medical apprenticeships with different kinds of healers and so forth, I always saw the role of Buddhism in their healing practices. And so for me, right from the beginning, I discovered Buddhism and medicine as these two completely intertwined and inseparable fields. And it was only much later, actually, when I came back to the States and sort of like found out more about Western Buddhism that I suddenly was surprised to realize how few people really appreciate the depth of that interconnection. So I came back to the States to go to graduate school and really explore that connection from a more historical standpoint. Went back to the University of Virginia, did my master's there, and then went and did my PhD in Johns Hopkins in the history of medicine with a focus on Buddhist medicine in medieval China.
Mhm. That's fantastic. And longtime listeners of the podcast will always note that I will cheer and applaud any UVA connections, having gone there myself. And yeah, that's so interesting that kind of by experiencing this Vipassana retreat and this um, medical training, that you experience those as fundamentally intertwined from the very beginning, such that coming back to the US, you were surprised that anyone would think of those as quite different. And an interesting thing about my own background is I studied religious studies at the UVA, but also chemistry because I intended to become a medical doctor. And so my interest in understanding how humans work and how humans sometimes don't work, I always saw those as very interconnected. And kind of along the way, I ended up writing my dissertation on pilgrimage instead of the history of medicine, um, but have always sort of seen those things as interestingly connected. What for you are some of the points of, like, where specifically do they connect?
Mm. Yeah. Well, I guess from a doctrinal standpoint, if you wanted to sort of like start with the text and start with the doctrine, Buddhism has pretty much everywhere, as far as I know, has always described itself as being the ultimate cure for suffering, right? Or the ultimate solution for um, the predicament of being a human being and the dukkha that is involved with being a human being, right? The suffering, the dissatisfaction of being human. And so all over the world in all of the Buddhist cultures that I've been familiar with, that idea of suffering has explicitly included health related ailments, both mental and physical health. And so, insofar as Buddhism is presenting itself as a solution or a cure for suffering, Buddhism has always introduced various kinds of techniques and ideas and practices related to the alleviation of illness. So in in many cases, those are philosophical interventions, right? Like, or you could say maybe meditation based interventions, which lead you towards realization that the body is impermanent, or that that's the experience of suffering is empty, right? So there's kind of these practices that really are geared towards transcending the suffering, you could say. But Buddhism everywhere has also always um, promoted and developed much more practical interventions, applied interventions, things like herbal medicine and different kinds of contemplations that deal with specific visualizations, you could say, for example, or dietary practices or ritual practices that relate to alleviating suffering as well. And that's really true, of uh, Buddhism, whether it's Theravada Buddhism, Southeast Asia, or Mahayana Buddhism in East Asia, or Vajrayana Buddhism in Central Asia or other parts of Asia, or if we're talking about modern secular Buddhism, which again is interested in health and both mental and physical health, as we can see through the mindfulness research, MBSR research, and so forth. So it's just this kind of like perennial theme throughout the Buddhist tradition throughout the centuries. And I got interested in the history of that. How far back could we trace the origins of those ideas and practices? And what's the relationship, or what's the role that Buddhism has in spreading medical ideas between cultures and around Asia and ultimately around the world. So these are all the kind of questions that they're more scholarly questions that were inspired through my shift from sort of living in Asia and being a practitioner to a more scholarly perspective. But they all were inspired by my experiences in the 90s in Thailand.
Hmm. Yeah, that sort of dual notion of, let's say you're faced with some sort of suffering in your life, maybe some sort of bodily suffering in particular, that you have one path is, well, if you meditate, perhaps you'll realize the body's impermanent, and then you can sort of relativize that suffering or learn to approach it in a different sort of way. Or the other path is to, well, let's figure out what the physical cause of that suffering is and think about the different types of interventions that we perhaps have to address it, and that both of these kind of go together in Buddhist history.
Yeah, and I guess I want to like make a point because it's often the case that contemporary Buddhists that have a more secular meditation focused practice um, will emphasize the former over the latter, and will sort of consider um, the kinds of interventions that we're talking about here, specific practical interventions as being secondary or beside the point of Buddhism, or cultural baggage. I've heard that term being used for healing practices and so forth. And that's I just want to point out that that's I mean that's not a it's not an unpopular view. There's many people who express that view all around the world today, including in Asia and so forth. But it's historically uninformed because if you actually look at the history, um, it really seems that Buddhism's involvement in healing and the innovation of healing techniques within Buddhist circles and Buddhist institutions, the promises being made and the practices being implemented by Buddhists throughout history related to medicine really have been at the leading edge of why Buddhism is globally significant. It's one of the major reasons why Buddhism spreads from one country to another. One of the major reasons why in places as diverse as Japan and Thailand and China and Mongolia, people um, adopted Buddhism and accepted Buddhism, and enthusiastically so. When you look at the history, it often comes down to the medical techniques and claims being made by the tradition. And I would say we're experiencing the exact same thing in a lot of ways in the contemporary world, where it's really meditation's ability to reduce stress and to provide more mental health benefits that are really, again, the leading edge of the Buddhist spread around the world today to places, like the U.S. and Canada and Europe and so forth. It's often people hear about the stress reduction benefits or the other health related benefits first, and that brings them to the practice of meditation, which then brings them to Buddhism. So I think it's very easy to discount healing, in the histories of Buddhism. But when you actually look into the history, you find that healing is just absolutely everywhere, and it's not a secondary topic, but it's actually often the primary topic.
Mhm. Yes, I'm reminded of a story that Jay Garfield used to tell students. He imagined, some of his students coming to him and saying, I want to help, poor, underdeveloped people in places, that don't have access to Buddhist teachings, and I want to teach them how to meditate and solve their problems. And Jay would say that's like adding insight to injury. Like if you want to go to communities where you can be of some service, going to med school or learning how to actually, heal the causes of people's suffering, as you said, often gets discounted in the ways that Buddhism is talked about in the popular media, even as you say, the health benefits, the wellness benefits, might be one of the buzzwords today, is why people are interested in Buddhism. I'm teaching Intro to Buddhism right now, and all of my students have done some sort of meditation and mindfulness, and usually they say they learned it from their therapists. My students are anxious, they're struggling with mental health, and that's how they encounter Buddhism in certain kinds of ways. So, another thing you mentioned in your response there is that understanding how Buddhism and medicine are intertwined helps us understand historically how Buddhist traditions developed. Um, can you say a little bit
Yeah.
more about that? What do you mean?
Yeah. Well, I think that this topic is it has been underrepresented actually on both sides. So I did my PhD in the history of medicine in a history of medicine department, and as part of the basic training for that department, we all had to do a survey of um, you know medical history, and so I read textbooks on history of medicine globally, and not one of them mentioned the role of Buddhism anywhere in them. And they talk about Hippocratic medicine and Ayurveda and Chinese medicine and Islamic medicine and modern medicine and so forth, but don't mention Buddhism anywhere. And similarly, I think it's entirely possible to, in an academic introduction to Buddhism, to not read anything about medicine or healing. And in most of the basic textbooks that we use in college don't actually include or include very little medical or healing information. Uh, but when you actually go to Asia and go to a culture where Buddhism has been part of the society for many centuries, you see Buddhist healing everywhere. There isn't a Buddhist temple, um, anywhere in the world, I would argue, that doesn't have people going there to pray and to chant and to do rituals for healing purposes. And frequently there are, ritual practices and services that are specifically intended um, to bring people in who are either themselves sick or have loved ones who are. There are, all kinds of different dietary and food practices within the Buddhist world, all kinds of other connections between Buddhism and health and healing. And so I think, from both sides, whether you're coming at this through the history of medicine lens or you're coming at this through sort of like learning about Buddhism, that this topic is somehow overlooked. And I think it happens because in the history of medicine, you can just write this topic off as being about religion, and in religious studies, you can just kind of write this topic off as being, non-religious. So because it's sitting at this kind of like intersection between these two disciplines, at least in the scholarly community, we tend to stick to our silos pretty well. So we can easily overlook a really central topic because of our commitments to looking at things in a certain way. So for me, because I spent all that time in Thailand and was immersed in this sort of like Buddhist medicine kind of culture there, coming back into the academy and learning about Buddhism and history of medicine in graduate school, that always perplexed me how medicine was missing, how Buddhist medicine was missing from both fields, and so it really drove me to my dissertation project, eventually my books, and all my publications really center around trying to rectify that missing piece.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm reminded of, in some ways, this is a fairly basic Buddhist point, which is that the categories through which we see the world affects, how we see the world. And we take our categories as sort of assumed basic things and then assume that the things that we see through those categories are universally true. But particularly those of us coming from English speaking contexts will tend to see, religion as something that has to do with kind of inner spiritual beliefs and ideas about God and philosophy, and religion as kind of scientific and divorced, or see medicine as scientific and divorced from religion. And in some ways, that affects academic disciplines as well, right? If history of medicine is going to be largely sort of leaving out religion, and programs in religious studies will maybe not talk about as much about religion, whereas your experience on the ground showed that those kind of categories in English that make these things seem so separate is totally an illusion of the language that we use to look at them.
Yeah, that's one of the big points in my my dissertation, the book that came out of my dissertation, published in 2014, called "Translating Buddhist Medicine in Medieval China." So in that book, one of the main arguments I was making there is that exactly what you said, that these categories, religion and medicine, they are English words with a history in Europe going back, many centuries at this point. But they are being used, we're using these terms, religion and medicine, in ways that are very particular to Western culture in the modern period. And when you go and you look at the pre-modern period and you look at other cultures, particularly around Asia, it's an open question to what extent they carved up the world of knowledge in the same way that we do. And one of the arguments was making in that book is looking at medieval China. I don't really see. I think there might be words that were used in certain times or places that had similar meaning to what we might think of as religion, or similar meaning to what we might think of as medicine. But in that society in the medieval period, these these concepts were not rigidly separated out in the way that they are in the modern Western context. And so it actually it does us a disservice to bring those terms and apply them onto that time and place. And instead we should focus on, what words were they using to describe what they were doing. And I think that's, that point being made about medieval China, you could apply to, any Buddhist culture, to really ask the question, does really rigorously separating out, religion and medicine in our modern Western ideas of those words, does it really add clarity to the picture, when it comes to modern Cambodia or modern Tibet or whatever? Does it add clarity to the picture, or does it just kind of like impose our own categories onto other people? And I think, sometimes it's beneficial, and sometimes they are grappling with concepts like that, and sometimes, it's really, we're just bringing our own biases. So I feel like having an open mind about categories and how we're using them is really, much more sensible.
Mhm. Yes, and that's always my pitch to, um, folks who maybe are interested in Dharma, interested in meditation, who say, I don't really care about the history of Buddhism. What's the usefulness of it today? For me, in my practice, dealing with the various problems that all of us have to deal with, and I always, say history allows us to kind of get out of our assumed categories and our received wisdom, and puts a little bit of a check on our tendency to project back in time the way that we take our present world to be, um, in the particular
Yeah.
context in which we grew up. And
Well, as a historian, I totally agree with you.
yes, go history. And, another thing that I talk about, so I'm teaching again Intro to Buddhism. I don't think I have anything on medicine. And so now talking to you, I really should reconsider adjusting the syllabus. But we're talking about, the Bodhisattva vows in Mahayana. And my background is as a Tibetanist. And so you'll talk about the Ripe Nga, like the Pancha Vidya, the five kind of, how do you translate Vidya, sciences, knowledges, areas of study. But that if you want to be a good bodhisattva, you need to know these areas. And one of them is always medicine. That a good bodhisattva who is aiming at relieving the suffering of all beings needs to know how the body works and how to cure the things that ail the body. And so we do talk
Yeah,
about that,
I
which
mean,
is a
there's all
backdoor.
kinds of
Sorry, I'm talking over
there's
you.
all kinds of entry points, I was going to say, into this. That's okay. There's all kinds of entry points into this, I think, in an undergraduate class, coming in from the historical side, like you were just doing, like coming in from this, doctrine of the Panchavidya. That's definitely one way in. I think, Vimalakirti lying on his sickbed and arguing, for the emptiness of the illusory nature of illness and so forth, or the Mahaparinibbana Sutra, where the Buddha is, passing away, and he's making the same argument. Like those are interesting entry points textually as well. Um, one of the ways that I really have been emphasizing the sort of the larger role of Buddhism in people's lives beyond just texts and meditation has been to focus on, so I teach outside of Philadelphia, so to focus on the lived Buddhism right in our own city. So in Philadelphia, uh, I've been leading students on a ethnographic research project for, we actually stopped before the pandemic, or when the pandemic happened in 2020, but before that we were for about 6 years running a project in the city, doing interviews in a number of different temples, and we eventually made relationships with about 45 different temples, and students were doing interviews and taking photos. And eventually I did a collaboration with a documentary filmmaker in 2018, named Lan Lee, and we went out to all these temples and did just made some short documentary films about all the many ways that these temples were involved with healing. And it's not just meditation, but also, as I was saying earlier, rituals and food and social dimensions of healing. How these temples also are filling gaps in the healthcare system by providing patients with translation services and transportation, and other health clinics and other kinds of all sorts of other kinds of interfaces with mainstream healthcare. And in addition to that, traditional medicine and other kinds of connections too. So yeah, so we have these little videos on the website jivaka.net, and each one of the films is accompanied by a little background information and some additional reading and some study questions. So I've been using that with my students since we created that over the last couple of years, where they haven't been able to go out in the field because of the concerns about COVID. And it's also something that, a lot of undergraduate classes have used, elsewhere in places where maybe you don't have such a diverse group of Asian American temples, to take students to. So it can be sort of like a way of introducing students to the lived experience of American Buddhism as well.
Mhm. Yes, speaking from Wyoming, we have less immediately accessible um, Buddhist temples to take students on field trips. And yes, this is at jivaka.net. We'll put a link in the show notes, and there's lots of really wonderful resources, both if you're just interested in learning more about lived religion in various Buddhist communities in Philadelphia, if you are teaching about Buddhism and want to find a way to bring this into, places where you can make this the subject of discussion, and lots of really wonderful things. And what's useful about that is, as you said, if you're learning about Buddhism, chances are in a Buddhism Intro 101 class, even the BSO 101 that I taught for Buddhist Studies Online, right? You're always trying to fit 2,500 years of history into, I think I got 6 90-minute lectures, and you're always making decisions about what to keep in and what to leave out. And, one thing that very frequently does get left out is medicine, but then, the various other aspects of how Buddhism is lived and practiced by people alive today. Why do you think that those things are really important to remember, even for people who are interested perhaps more in the philosophy and meditation side?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I mean, one thing that comes to mind, again, if we're just sort of talking about how people often impose their own kind of interpretation or perspective or categories onto the past or onto other cultures, it's certainly true that the so-called mindfulness revolution has introduced all kinds of people in the West to Buddhism and Buddhist meditation. Um, so many more people, millions more people know about meditation and the benefits of Buddhist meditation through that popularity, which is great. But often mindfulness is introduced in a way that is completely separated out from Buddhism altogether. Like you mentioned, that a lot of students have been introduced to mindfulness by their therapist. So, often in that kind of context, uh, it's not even mentioned that this practice comes from, Buddhist tradition. But if they are aware of, Buddhism more generally, it tends to be, in my experience, that people who are new to Buddhism, people in the West who are new to Buddhism, if they don't have Buddhism in their family heritage or in their cultural heritage, because it's very easy for them to see Buddhism as really only meditation, and to miss the much larger, much richer context for the practice. So, and that includes all of the ethical considerations. It includes all of the really amazing art and cultural production that's gone around Buddhism. It's missing all of the really important role that Buddhism plays in people's lived experience and their families and their personal lives. And it's missing, really the vast majority of what is Buddhism, right? And is really just focused on the experience of, Western, mostly white, mostly middle class folks doing meditation. So for me, one of the most important things that we're doing in an intro course on Buddhism is taking people from the starting point, which is enthusiasm for meditation, which is great, and not to detract from that, but to lead from that starting point into all of these other dimensions of Buddhism that can supplement their understanding and really show them a much more holistic picture of what this is all about.
Mhm. One other thing that I love
Mm.
about having heard you talk about the Jivaka project before is the way that you speak to how it meaningfully invites students into the process of co-creating this knowledge about Buddhist medicine, insofar as many of your students may come from the communities where these sorts of things are practiced. And maybe some of the message that they get from the fact that Buddhist meditation is always the thing that gets talked about is that, we don't want to hear about your, cultural practices, your cultural baggage, but by instead inviting those students to take you back to their community or to meet people that you know, that in effect this helps students who come from communities in which Buddhism and Buddhist practices of medicine are practiced, allows them to kind of participate in this process of learning about Buddhist cultures and teaching others about Buddhist cultures. Does that capture sort of
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
some of your aim in
Yeah,
there?
definitely. So yeah, so you were paying attention when I presented on this before, because that, to me, that is one of the main takeaways. I mentioned I teach outside of Philadelphia, so we at Abington College have a, minority majority student population, with many students from Asia. I think it's maybe like, I don't know, 20% or so of our students self-identify as Asian. Many of them come from the Philadelphia neighborhoods, where these temples are located. And so, in fact, this whole project really emerged out of students who were connected with those communities doing ethnography in their grandmother's temple, or in a temple where they were members of the community and able to speak the language, and to some extent, and to take other students into those temples and share with them their culture, and really sort of act as um, liaisons in some respect, but also as sort of content experts to some extent. And so in those contexts, for me, I've been very much learning alongside the other students, right? As the for example, the Cambodian student like comes back from the Cambodian temple with stories about the community there. I've really learned so much from the ethnographic work, that students like that have been bringing back to the classroom and sharing with all of us. So, and yeah, and for me, like, as somebody who, I had a, I guess maybe it's slightly broader exposure to Buddhism than a lot of other scholars, because I spent some time in Thailand and then I switched to medieval China. So I have a little bit of knowledge about both of these contexts, but still very sort of small window onto the overall, the whole Buddhist tradition. So really to learn from students about the contemporary lived experience of Buddhist communities right up the street from where I live. It has been really, really fantastic. Um, I wanted to come back to something that you said about shoving 2,500 years of history into what did you say, into 6 lectures?
Yes, or
Because
14 weeks or whatever format that we have. I was invited to by
whatever
our
format
honors
we have,
college
yeah.
to give a 30-minute lecture on Buddhism.
Yeah,
Where do you
everything you want to
start?
know about Buddhism in 30 minutes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely done those kinds of things too. And yeah, there's always a question of where to start. And I guess it's just my shtick is to start with, you've probably heard about mindfulness. Well, there's all this other stuff that, is relevant for mental and physical health, and let's use that as an entree into Buddhism, and then we can talk about some of the philosophy, some of the practices, some of the global diversity, of different times and places. Um, so I guess I would do something like that in 30 minutes. But no, what I wanted to mention was just that the course that we're meeting here to talk about, the course on Buddhist studies, on yoga studies website, is itself a phenomena. It's an example of this phenomenon of trying to shove 2,500 years of history into, in this case, 4 lectures or 4 sessions. And it's also based on a book that I just wrote where I tried to tell the entire history of Buddhism and medicine throughout the last 2,500 years or so that Buddhism has been around. Though I tried to tell that history in a very concise, 200 and some odd pages. So I'm very familiar with the process of distilling this topic down into sort of like what are the main takeaways, and then leaving breadcrumbs, citations, and other kinds of information for people to go and explore the details in more, all the various different kinds of diverse directions that you could take this topic in. So, yeah, so it's a huge topic, and it's impossible to get to the bottom of it. But hope to provide some starting points for people to be able to begin that exploration.
Mhm. Yes, and that book is A Global History of Buddhism and Medicine, Columbia University Press, 2021. We'll have a link in the show notes. Always got to throw in some book promo there, and
Yeah,
but yes, that this whole topic reminds me of as you said, learning from your students. Um, at my university, at the University of Wyoming, I am the only person who teaches the history, philosophy, or religious traditions of all of Asia, which is a very long time and place. And sometimes students come up to me and ask if I know anything, and I always feel so. Um, I have a very specific training related to my knowledge of pilgrimage in Tibet from 1600 to 1800, and but then I get put in front of a room with lots of students and say, let's be really humble about what it is that we know and what we can learn. And that in any class, hopefully, you'll get some tools and techniques and some sort of specific examples to work through. But ultimately, you hope that it just opens the door for people to keep asking questions, keep exploring, all of those kinds of things. How did you go about, thinking about putting together this course as we're talking about making these very difficult choices about where to start, what to include? How did you think about that?
yeah. This course, well, actually, it's the same story, right? The global history of Buddhism and medicine, over the whole span of time and all, and all of Asia and then all of the world. That same story, I've told it in a number of different formats. So it started actually, I had in mind that I was going to write this book, but it started actually as a collection, 2 volume collection of 2 volume anthology of translations that I had a whole lot of colleagues contribute to, that collects together a primary source base that spans from early Pali text all the way to the present, related to Buddhism and medicine. And then based on that collection of sources, I then was able to write this book that sort of like stitched all of that together into a larger coherent narrative. So then the course that I developed for you guys is a it's now a summary of that book, sort of highlights from the book, leading people on a journey through the first we talk about, why is this subject important. That's the whole first week, is looking really at the 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 critical importance of Buddhism and medicine, and how to think about that in both as a phenomenon within Buddhist traditions, but then also as a phenomenon in global history. So that's the first um, lecture, or the first unit, and then the next one is on sort of the whole summary of the various doctrines and practices coming out of early Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Vajrayana Buddhism. And then we get the third session is running that now throughout pre-modern history, going from the ancient period through to the about 1600 or so, and then the final session picks up that story from that period and goes through to the present. So it sort of follows the pattern of the chapter structure of the book itself. And I did that sort of, I mean, kind of with the intention that if people were uh, interested in more information, then the lectures and the discussions in the course would very easily pair with the book itself, and so they could,
Mhm.
um, learn in one or both of those ways as they saw fit.
Mhm. That it's kind of
I sort of have
scalable.
an
You could take
accompaniment.
the course, or you could read the book, which is going to provide some more detail, or delve into the primary sources.
Correct. Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
And that each of these things kind of helps reinforce. And so maybe I always thought with those intro courses, this is going to just be a really broad introduction, and then maybe you'll say, oh, I'm really interested in this piece, and where do I kind of zoom in to that one, and find
Correct.
whatever kind of is of particular interest. One of the things that has always intimidated me with Buddhism and medicine is the notion that, as you said in your brief description of that second module, is that it's hugely diverse, varying greatly from culture to culture. And so, you might look at Buddhist medicine in India, might be quite different from Tibet, might be quite different from Thailand, might be quite different from China, just because there's always a great deal of cultural adaptation and borrowing in response to local particular contexts and whatnot. What are there themes that kind of span throughout these different cultural areas, or how diverse is it versus how much is there a kind of central Buddhist idea about medicine?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great sort of starting point question, to get into, the topic. And so I think what's important there is to just kind of be clear about how I use the term Buddhist medicine, because I've actually had some disagreements with other scholars who use the term in different ways and so forth. And so for me, I use the term Buddhist medicine just like I would use the term Buddhist art. And Buddhist art is such a wide category, because it covers basically like any form of art that has anything to do with Buddhism at any time in history from any culture, right? So, of course, Buddhist art is going to be completely different from place to place and time to time, right? So, like a sculpture from ancient India and a brush painting, a Zen calligraphy brush painting from, medieval Japan, and a manga comic book, about Buddhist superheroes that is published in Singapore, are today are going to be so different from one another, but yet we still can hang them together under this category of Buddhist art, and I'm using Buddhist medicine in a similar way. So I'm not meaning to point to, there are places like Tibet's a great example, where you have a formal medical tradition, a lineage with texts and with lineage transmission practices, with certain body of knowledge that you're supposed to know and be adept at. Um, a whole medical tradition that is said to originate with the medicine Buddha, and to the foundational texts of this tradition called Sowa Rigpa are the four tantras, right? It's literally a scripture that's spoken by the medicine Buddha. So there are traditions like that that certainly qualify as Buddhist medicine, but I'm also meaning to include um, the kinds of organizations, like, for example, Suji, which is an organization based in Taiwan today, that does they're a Buddhist organization, a Buddhist order that has literally millions of volunteers, and they do all kinds of relief work in all over the world. They're creating medical clinics, free medical clinics, and hospitals. You know, and that's biomedical medicine, right? It's modern scientific medicine that they're offering in those places. But they see that as entirely uh, uh, the building of these hospitals and the provisioning of the hospitals and raising funding and getting the volunteers to work and so forth. All of that is for them framed as bodhisattva work, right? Bodhisattva path, and they see themselves as being the hands of Guanyin Bodhisattva, the thousand-armed Guanyin Bodhisattva that supposedly can appear and manifest in all different ways and create to help people, to help suffering beings all over the cosmos. Well, they see themselves as the hands of Guanyin, actually carrying out the bodhisattva work to reduce people's suffering. So that's very much for me also Buddhist medicine, even though what they're doing is contemporary surgery and biomedicine, right? So I'm using that term in this very loose way in order to capture as many different kinds of practices as I can and bring them all together into some kind of comparative conversation, which is what we do with Buddhist art, right? Not to say that there aren't big differences between Japanese art and Indian art and so forth, but when we bring them together to look at the commonalities, we discover what is common to the Buddhist art tradition, right? So I would definitely say that by bringing all of these really diverse practices from all sorts of times and places together does reveal some underlying themes within this larger Buddhist medicine tradition. And some of them you could maybe predict, right? Like the use of meditation and other contemplative practices for sure is one. The use of compassion, or the value, the importance of compassion and generosity, dana within the larger tradition is obvious. The you know the appearance again and again of this metaphor that the Buddha is the great physician, right? Or that medicine, that the Dharma is this great medicine, like these kinds of medical stories and languages and similes and metaphors and tropes and narratives and so forth. Like that's another really obvious, maybe predictable sort of commonality between these. Um, but then there's like some things that are maybe surprising, which is for example, there's a core set of rituals that really are found across all Buddhist cultures, that where healing rituals are done in a particular way according to particular logics. The specifics of what that looks like, actually, what the material culture exactly is and what the aesthetic is really different from place to place. But there's kind of a cluster of basic ritual practices that are um, at their core are shared across Asia, and then there's beyond that, there's some very specific things that circulated widely around Asia, specific texts that played a role all across Asia in informing medical practice, and certain ideas that are picked up again and again and again throughout history. That so we go from really broad sort of generalizations to very specific kinds of like doctrines and practices that circulated. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, and so again, it's very hard to summarize all of that in a quick statement. But it's part of what I'm trying to do in the courses, and definitely get into a lot more detail in the book, is to sort of provide the details of those shared ingredients.
Mhm. And that's a useful question, thinking about how you are defining Buddhist medicine where kind of a narrow definition might be to say, okay, I'm going to go to Tibet and I'm going to find the Sowa Rigpa, the medicine section of like the doctrinal texts, and everything in there I'm going to consider Buddhist medicine, and everything that's not in there, that's different. Whereas you're kind of casting this broad net to say, if this metaphor of healing occurs in this ritual manual, or this tantric text promises to have benefits for this, bodily ailment, or, it's casting this broader net such that you can see broader themes emerge. Does that capture the kind of broader definition?
It, yeah, and that's very much just how my mind works. It's kind of like that. I'm that kind of thinker, right? A lumper together, right? As opposed to a splitter aparter. So like that's my preference when it comes to how to do scholarship. And I love that we can do scholarship in different ways. And there are people that just like want to focus on one specific year or one specific decade or one specific text and spend their whole career working on that one thing, which is great, because I'm so dependent on those people to be doing that kind of work in order to do my work, which is like stitching together all of these examples into a larger story. So I feel like we have this. I feel very grateful for all of the scholars who have contributed to my anthologies and whose work I'm citing in all of my work, because I wouldn't be able to do what I do without them doing what they do. But yeah, I am definitely on this more, expansive sort of, where I like to work on this kind of more expansive scale, trying to pull together a lot of discrete examples in order to make a larger story, to tell a larger pattern. And then I know that, of course, that I've done that based on the scholarship up till now, and that the picture is going to change. And if I was writing this book 40 years from now, I'd be saying something probably quite different than what I'm saying today. But hopefully, what the book does is provide sort of a state of the field where we're at right now, and kind of like a platform on which it's like a base camp on which to do the next, the next cycle of scholarship.
Mm-hmm. To integrate all
Yeah.
these, for listeners, sometimes the currency of the realm in academic Buddhist studies is, can you pick the most specific niche thing and write the most kind of esoteric journal article about it? And yeah, maybe no one's going to read it, but at least, you did this wonderful thing. And that is wonderful work, and we're very grateful for those people. But any of you who have tried to read them may find, as many of us have found, that it's like very hard to get into if you're not already an expert. And so the field also contains people who survey lots of things and bring them together, and then folks who are communicators between the really niche research and a broader public audience. And, basically
Yeah.
all of us have to work together because, again, 2,500 years of history across all disciplines, across, huge swaths of territory. And I've always really appreciated your writing because, as somebody who didn't specialize in Buddhist medicine, I can actually read your writing and not feel immediately lost. So,
Well, I appreciate that. And that is coming from the fact that I am trying to stitch together, a lot of different specialists' work, and be able to pull it all together into a larger story that can be read by any of those specialists, right? So I'm trying to like bring in material from Japan and from Tibet and from Vietnam and from Laos, and put it all together in a story that then could be read by any one of those scholars, but then also could be read by historians of medicine, or could be read by other adjacent fields. And so and this particular book that we're talking about, I negotiated with the press to release it simultaneously as a paperback, because just, little inside knowledge for people who aren't familiar with the academic publishing industry. But usually what happens is publishers publish books, they charge a ton of money, because they're only expecting, they only publish hardcover books, and they're expecting libraries to buy them, and to have no market for the just ordinary readers. But I negotiated with the press and said, like, I'm going to write this book in a way that should, be accessible to. Now, it's not easy reading. It is a hefty, book, but I wrote it in a way that it would be accessible to not just scholars, but to people who were, meditators or or were Asian medicine practitioners or had other interest in related to Buddhism and medicine, that they would get something out of it. So the press thankfully said yes, and they published it as a paperback. So you can now buy the Global History of Buddhism and Medicine for $30 instead of for like 100, right? So it's
140 is the
um,
hardback, and the
yeah,
paperback is
okay,
much
yeah.
more affordable.
To my point, yeah.
Yes.
So and then this course is kind of also part of that effort to then further make accessible on ramps to that literature or to that scholarship. So like what you were saying, I really am hoping that somebody who is interested in this topic would take this class, and maybe like one of my slides really speaks to them, or maybe one of the sessions really speaks to them, and then they're able to parlay that from into getting the book and looking at that chapter, and then continuing to dig deeper, like you said. The book from there references people to the anthologies for the source material, and then also references people to all of the scholarship that I'm basing my one paragraph will have like 50 50 citations on it, because it's I'm really trying to do something comprehensive in the book, which is to really introduce all of the scholarship that I know of that's been done on this topic. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of citations to other work, and lists of sort of like my kind of greatest hits of like further readings to do, and a lot of um, kind of yeah, tendrils being sent out into the world of scholarship, and people want to follow those threads and go explore.
Mhm.
They're welcome to.
Well, maybe one little tendril. I was, in prepping for this, I initially, because we're in different time zones, I initially thought the interview was 3 hours ago and was like scrambling to prepare. But then when we cleared up those issues, um, I was chatting with a colleague of mine who has her PhD in bioethics and teaches at the med school a required ethics class. And I was telling her about this book, and she's like, "Oh, I should get my students to read this," because she was trained in a philosophical tradition where bioethics, medical ethics, was never read a single thing from Asia, but felt overwhelmed about where to
Mm,
start. And I said, "I got the perfect book for you."
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, it's exactly people like that I was hoping would have this kind of entree into the field, right? Because that person would never pick up 70 different articles on Buddhist medicine practice in Tibet or something like that, right? But in my book, I have a section on medical ethics. It's part of chapter 4. There's a little like 4-page summary of like medical ethics in Buddhism, and a bunch of citations to a bunch of work, and some primary sources there too. So yeah, so somebody could just jump right in, and that's what I'm hoping. People who come to the course, if you just come to the class and you get an overall sense of the big picture, and that's enough, then that's fine. But if you do find something that's of interest, then there would be a very easy way to go right from the course to the book to the additional sources.
mhm. And the other thing I appreciate about your sort of interdisciplinary approach here, um, connects to teaching generally. So teaching for Buddhist studies online, yogic studies. We have wonderful, interesting, engaged audiences, and both of us teach at sort of widely accessible public schools, and so it's an interesting thing to do both kinds of teaching. I love working with the kinds of students that we have, Buddhist studies online, yogic studies, and I love working with my students. But my university students are often thoroughly baffled by disciplinary boundaries. And if I was to say, "Oh,
Hmm.
we're going to study this topic, but in this way and in this one way only," they're like, "Why? Why not sort of incorporate all sorts of art history and anthropology and history and philosophy and all of those kinds of things?" And so part of communicating to a broader audience that again doesn't sort itself neatly into our academic categories is being willing to draw from all of the wonderful resources that we have. And so do you think of like
Yeah,
your
so I
teaching?
I totally
Sorry, I keep
I,
speaking
I
over you.
totally resonate with what you're saying right there. Yeah, sorry, we have a little delay maybe on the connection, but I totally resonate with what you're saying because for me, like I told you my story that I was in Thailand and learned about the intersections of Buddhism and medicine in practice in the contemporary world, and then I came back and started looking into history as well. But I told you I had also have undergraduate degrees in anthropology and also cognitive science, right? So you could just see from the story I told you that like my journey wasn't a disciplinary one at all. And I, have sort of I've played by the rules of the game, right? And that got me my job, it got me tenure and promotion and all of that. I played by the rules of the game as a historian. But I've always been kind of like on the far edge of disciplinary history, right? And what I'm doing is a lot more interdisciplinary, and I describe myself and have for many years as transdisciplinary because I'm actually just interested in the subject of Buddhist medicine, and I've approached that from a lot of different angles, right? As a practitioner, as a historian, as a documentary filmmaker, as a podcaster, as a teacher. I write about contemporary stuff. I write stuff for for Tricycle magazine, and for the I wrote this book Buddhist for the wider public. So I haven't really fit into those disciplinary boxes that you're talking about. Um, Although I played by the rules of one of those disciplinary boxes in order to sort of like, do what I needed to do to get tenure and so forth. It's my firm conviction that those disciplinary divides are just artificial kind of artifacts of the early modern European university system, and that they're not doing us any kind of service. So I do my best to kind of break those down. And actually, I'm really fortunate that the school where I'm teaching is small enough that we don't have departments. We have a division of arts and humanities. So I'm able to teach also sort of like across a whole bunch of disciplines as well.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and
yeah.
thinking about, part of the project of Buddhist Studies Online, Yogic Studies is breaking out of academic siloing, right? Because we, myself as a creature fully created by the academy, um, at times you feel constrained by that. Other times you feel safe within your little walls and your disciplinary boundaries. But I know part of the goal that Seth had in founding Yogic Studies is like, how do we as academics talk better to normal people? Um, and I've
Yeah.
always really
Because
admired.
we're definitely not normal
No,
anymore.
no, you spend enough time, deep in the stacks of the library with all the $140 hardcover books. It changes you, and not always for the better. But finding
Yeah,
those ways
definitely.
to broadly communicate. And I'm, as someone doing a podcast literally right this second, you mentioned a podcast. And I know from our brief chat before recording that you said that you have a podcast forthcoming.
Yeah, so well, first of all, I was just going to give you kudos for like what you guys are doing because I think both Buddhist Studies Online and Yoga Studies and the now merging into one organization, but the both of those organizations I think have been really providing a fantastic service and something that I really would have valued back when I was a practitioner and wanting to get access to academic information and not being able to find it, having to delve into the materials myself. Ultimately, that encouraged me to become an academic, and I realized that was my path. But I've always felt like I've always felt the lack of that kind of efforts to communicate across that divide of practitioners and scholars or lay audiences and scholars. So I really appreciate what you guys have been doing. And in a lot of ways, I've been trying to do that myself all along with these more public publications. Also, a lot of public speaking, a lot of podcasts and interviews, sort of YouTube things. I teach locally in public libraries for older audiences in the kind of the public library continuing ed space, and then teaching undergraduates as well. Yeah, and so you mentioned this podcast. My latest foray in public engagement and talking, trying to talk across those divides is to launch a podcast, which is going to be coming out in November of 2022. So that's just a couple weeks away from the time that we're recording this. And so it's gonna be a podcast called Blue Barrel, as in Beryl, as in the gemstone of the medicine Buddha. So Blue Barrel podcast is going to focus on Buddhism and health, and we're going to have a full year of guests starting in November that are dedicated to the topic of Buddhist medicine and exploring that from both the scholarly angle as well as some practitioners, and really looking at globally a lot of different cultures. And so, yeah, if anybody's listening to this and you want to come along for the ride, that might be a place to find more information about Buddhist medicine and get more into this subject from different perspectives. Blue Barrel will be available wherever podcasts are streamed, and I think we're going to house it at my website, which is just for now, it's going to be housed at my website, which is just my name, piersalguero.com.
Nice. And it sounds, as though this same interdisciplinary method of talking to scholars and practitioners and all sorts of different people is going to be exemplified in this podcast, which sounds really great. And yes, that's always, sometimes I'll give quick tips for students of, if you ever go to an art museum and someone says, "Who's that Buddha?" You can usually recognize the medicine Buddha because he is blue. And that usually comes from this beryl, which is kind of like a scholar's debate, but maybe sapphire or something.
Yeah.
And so that sounds like a really fantastic podcast, and I'll definitely be looking forward to it myself. As well as this course. So hopefully we've managed to give a kind of introduction to the various themes that'll be considered and the methods that'll be used. Pierce, is there anything else that you'd like to say to the listeners about the course before we sign off?
I guess the only thing I would say is just to welcome everybody from whatever backgrounds, whatever disciplines, whatever levels of experience, whatever kinds of previous explorations they may or may not have done. I think one of the benefits of me having been a practitioner and having this more interdisciplinary sort of approach myself is I feel like I am able to meet people sort of where they are and make things relevant and interesting to them. So, the lectures, they're pre-recorded, they're more in a historian's kind of voice, but the discussions that we're going to have throughout the course will feature people from different backgrounds asking questions and so forth. And so hopefully there'll be something for everybody in there, and just invite people to join in and to come on this exploration with us and bring whatever questions and ideas and perspectives you have.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful invitation, and I look forward to participating in the class myself. So I'll just end with a final thank you to Dr. Pierce Salguero for speaking with us on the Buddhist Studies podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. This was great. A lot of fun. Excellent.
And thank you to all of you for listening, and we'll talk with you next time on the Buddhist Studies podcast.